Right, so after demonstrating that the US atomic bomb project was political theatre and then looking at Trinity and the alleged nuclear bombings to show that they were faked, I now want to move on to the rest of the nuclear club. First off, though, I just wanted to touch on the 1946 Operation Crossroads nuclear test in the Pacific Ocean to show you some more trickery. So these occurred in the Bikini Atoll. It was the Able bomb and Baker bomb test in 1946. These were both 23 kiloton bombs that were going off in a sort of a lagoon of a tropical island at the Bikini Atoll. Now, first thing to look at was some photos. We've got the first test here for Able and the second one for Baker. Okay, so in no particular order of importance, just to take this apart because these images are doctored. First thing to note is obviously both explosions are very big, which is what you'd expect. They would have had a very large shock wave as a result of this. It would have kicked up a lot of water. There'd been like a tsunami coming off of it. If you see in the foreground of both images, you can see that there's palm trees on the seashore with small huts and sort of a sunning platform or little miniature dock for boats to come up to, telegraph poles, things like that. It's a bit harder to see in the smaller resolution Able photograph, much more vivid in the second photo for Baker. Now, the idea is that the small structures and the trees would have been damaged and knocked over by the bomb blast, of course. The air shockwave, and if not that, then certainly the tidal shockwave, because these are all down by the waterline. So it's ridiculous to believe that the government presumably reconstructed and replanted trees in the 2 weeks between, or 3 weeks between the initial bomb and the second bomb. So first of all, this is very silly. These structures should not be visible in the second test. There's another photograph here of the Able test, allegedly, which gives you the nice sort of smoke ring of clouds and the mushroom fireball peeking over the top of it, and you can see the island atoll shoreline at the bottom of the picture and the boats around it. Of course, this is again, it's a shopped image. The mushroom cloud itself is far too bright in terms of how the lighting of the picture is set up. They've just inserted and cropped in the mushroom cloud amidst the ring of smoke. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the clouds themselves haven't also been put in there. So this is an edited photograph, and this is one of the official photographs of the Able detonation. The other point to recognise is that the two mushroom clouds are extremely different to look at, despite being the same size of bomb. You might be able to argue, it's like taken at a different time, or one was an aerial detonation, one was underwater, but still, it's a very different image in terms of scale. It's also relevant to note this image of Baker back to comparative explosions of scale to other nuclear bombs, because we'll see this with a lot of other explosions going off as we go forward, that they can't seem to get the facts straight about how large an explosion is. The Baker photo is also pretty egregious in terms of photoshopped boats. The idea is there are supposed to be all these ships parked around or docked around where the bomb goes off, because they wanted to test what damage is done to ships if you set off a nuke underneath them. But you can see these are just black outlines. If we zoom in a little more, we can see that they are literally just the silhouettes of boats. And there appears to be there's this sort of dark line, horizontal line in the water, but that's not the same thing as an actual tidal surge. So again, it's very strange. It's just a composite edited photo, and again, as we zoom in, we can see that the actual spout itself has a bizarre texture to it. Is this really water? On the right hand side, there's this sort of very sharp relief line of where the edge of the spout is, and it takes on an almost sort of furry texture, or like a carpet or something, or a very lush rug. So I don't even know if this is a water spout, or if it's not some sort of collage using images of some sort of thick pile carpet or sheep's wool that they've put in there to give the impression of a water spout. So then we have another image of the Baker detonation. This is of some sailors observing the bomb going off. So there's a few problems with this image too. The lighting's very strange. For some reason it's extremely bright on the right hand side of the screen, but on the left it's gone all dark. I assume the reason they've done that is because they had to get it to be essentially jet black in the ocean in the top left, because they wanted to shop in the ships to show that there's ships around the nuke that the sailors are supposedly looking at. Now, the problem with this is the ships that you can see on the horizon are not to scale. So they're far too large, considering the distance the sailors would be at. You shouldn't be able to see the ships as that big on the horizon. The nuclear cloud here as well is different to the first photo of Baker. It's got this big white foam base to it, which isn't seen in the other one. So yeah, the lighting's off. The ships have been shopped in, they're not to scale. This now has a white foam base, which isn't visible in the other photos. And of course the sailors aren't wearing any kind of protective equipment, they're just looking straight at it with binoculars, bare chested as well, so they would be of course hit by water level being tossed around, the air blast and radiation and so on, but they're not bothered about that. So it's another doctored photo. And then finally we have another image here of Baker post-detonation. Again, the image of the mushroom cloud shape is completely different. The clouds in the sky are different. The ships are somehow incredibly close to it without being knocked over, and they're sat on a kind of flat white plate dish rim that's going around the base of the blast, which I presume is supposed to be some sort of churned up water or expanding shockwave, which is somehow past the ships without knocking them over. So the photos are obviously doctored and ridiculous. So then they also talk about things like radiation. Chemist Glenn T. Seaborg of the Atomic Energy Commission called Baker the world's first nuclear disaster because of all the radioactive contamination from these huge explosion. The large thermonuclear test rendered Bikini unfit for farming and fishing, because of course there were people living on these islands, on this atoll, and they moved them off. They moved the whole population off to go live elsewhere, and it remained uninhabited for years as a result of this. Although, interestingly, it says here that it was occasionally visited by sports divers. They tried to say that life expectancy was reduced by 3 months, which is, of course, I would say an impossible thing to prove, because do you know how long someone's going to live for? They're not saying years, they're saying 3 months. It's like saying, oh, you're doing this, you lose a few weeks off your life. Well, how do we know it down to that level of precision? I don't think we do. The problem as well with the radiation is that you can look at the Bikini Atoll today, and it's lush. This place should look like the surface of the moon. I mean, to put it into perspective, they've had multiple bomb tests, not just Able Baker, they did others after at the same site, and they describe it in this article here that one of the detonations they did of a 15 megaton hydrogen bomb later was 1,000 times more powerful than the blast which destroyed Hiroshima, vaporizing part of the Marshall Islands with temperatures hitting 55,000 degrees centigrade or 99,000 Fahrenheit. The blast left a crater 2,200 yards across, 80 yards deep, shook islands more than 120 miles away, had a 5-mile wide fireball, and the mushroom cloud rose 100 kilometres over the South Pacific. Radioactive fallout reached Australia and Japan. But the problem is that this, as you see in this article from the Daily Mail, is that the coral in the water is flourishing. There's fish, sharks, turtles in the sea, a profusion of fish indeed. The underwater is healthy. The land itself is healthy. You can look at it on Google Map or look at photos of people having gone there. And it's perfectly lush and green. You can grow crops there. There's no problem. So this whole area should look like the surface of the moon. It should be completely annihilated. There shouldn't be any life there. Everything should just be, again, scorched, glassed, annihilated. And instead you've got just a regular island with trees growing on it and sand, and there's fish, and it's fine. It's not a toxic place to be. You can go diving there, and they're having to spin it in this article. They're trying to say that the reason it's pristine, of course, is because it evacuated people. That meant that mankind wasn't around to pollute it or something. So that well, of course it's fine, even though there should be an enormous crater and it should be glassed. Of course this is fine because people were taken away. So they're trying to spin it and say, oh, that's the reason why you can nuke a place to annihilation, but it's not a problem if you move the native population out. So Able Baker, the Bikini Atoll testing site, is a great example of, again, the US military. It's their first testing of nuclear weapons after Trinity, after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. They've got this site. They set off 2 nukes I've shown and other nukes later, allegedly. And what do we have to show for it? We have doctored photographs and nonsense results of a zero radiation environment that's healthy. So again, they're lying. They don't have nuclear weapons, and that's the US military as of 1946. Okay, so moving on, we're going to look at the other countries. As of post World War II, only one country is supposed to have nuclear weapons. This ticks through for a time until we get to the 29th of August 1949. So 1949 is when Russia, the Soviet Union, gets its own bombs. They get 22 kiloton plutonium implosion bombs. It was a bomb test called First Lightning, or as the Americans referred to it as Joe 1, Joseph Stalin. The reason the Russians were able to get this technology was from the Americans. If you read about the Russian atomic weapons program, they try and say that what happened was this guy, Georgy Flerov, who was a Soviet nuclear physicist, was basically, at the time, he was an Air Force lieutenant in the Soviet Air Force. He thought that it had all gone a bit quiet on the Western scientific front on the topic of fission, and the idea is he was supposed to be sat there in his barracks or something and scratching his chin and thinking, oh, why is it that they're not talking about making a bomb out of the idea of explosive uncontrolled nuclear fission? And he thought, it must be because they're secretly working on it in private. So he put pen to paper and he wrote to Stalin directly as an Air Force lieutenant. He wrote a letter to Stalin and said, "Dear Stalin, I think they're up to something and we should build a uranium bomb of our own without delay." Stalin got this letter, read it, went, "Yeah, that's a good idea, good job, boy." And then as a result, the Soviet weapons program for atomic research began. That's supposed to be the official way it happened. Slightly less officially, what happened was the Manhattan Project, one of their top scientists, was a chap called Klaus Fuchs, who was a German physicist who was then in the US, and he was working with the British and the Americans on the Manhattan Project. Now, he was actually an agent, he was an asset for the Soviets. He was feeding back his research data and any data he could get his hands on to his handler, who was known as Agent Sonia, aka Ursula Kaczynski, aka Ruth Werner. Now, she was a German Jewish Soviet spy handler, and she was basically coordinating this and getting the info from him and then passing it on to the Soviets. The other source that the Soviets had was Julius Ethel Rosenberg. Julius Rosenberg was a wealthy Russian Jewish immigrant living in New York, and his partner Ethel, originally Ethel Greenglass, was also a Jewish woman living in the US, and they're both communists. And what they did is they basically were spies, and the idea is that they stole a huge amount of information, stuff like radar, sonar, jet propulsion, and of course nuclear weapons designs from the US government, and then passed it back to the Soviet Union as well. So you have a sort of an interesting thing there where the Russians themselves, although yes, it's all very clever, they got it from spying. This is essentially an admission that they never researched it themselves. They basically got this information from the US by ill-gotten means. So the Soviets end up with this bomb, First Lightning. They set it off. Now it's interesting that they don't just use a gun-type nuclear bomb, because of course, if you've seen my previous episodes on this, there's supposed to be this whole mythology that the gun-type bomb is incredibly straightforward, it's really easy to design, it's really easy to use. Of course, they didn't need to test the gun-type bomb when they dropped it over Hiroshima. It's the rugged AK-47 of nuclear weapons. It's the plutonium implosion bomb that's the tricksy one. It's a difficult one to get to work. So it's interesting that the Soviets never even bothered with a gun-type bomb. They just went straight to the plutonium implosion. It's also hilarious to me that the Soviets were able to infiltrate the Manhattan Project from day one. So what's the evidence that they have this bomb? What do we know of it? So we have this highly technical design image that was passed on by the Rosenbergs to the Soviets there, showing put bombs around the metal and it makes a big boom design. We then have an image of the completed bomb, the casing. We have a photo of its detonation, and we have a short video showing the detonation. So that's the evidence they offer. So they fly the bomb out to this test site called Semipalatinsk, which is in Kazakhstan, and they detonate it. The bit of a problem with the image itself is that, again, as usual, we're getting a detonation that's just in the middle of nowhere. There's no real distinguishing features or landmarks. It's cloudy sky. We're just seeing this bomb go off, and no image of the aftermath in terms of a crater or anything like that. We've got no evidence to show any glassing or anything useful to see that it's this extremely high heat. All we have is a mushroom cloud. So this is essentially just a large explosion. There's nothing necessarily to indicate this is a special explosion, and we've got nothing to scale to indicate that this is a massive explosion. Even depending on how close the camera is, the regular sized explosion can be made to look big or small. So there's an issue with that.
Осталось 10, 9, 8, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Нажатия кнопки, все осветилось ярчайшим, никаких неприятностей не учинило. И я тоже находился вместе с нами в каземате. Он поцеловал Игоря Васильевича, поцеловал меня в лоб, и мы уже вышли, и вот видно было, как вот поднимается облако, образующее гриб.
Now, if we look at the footage of the explosion itself, if we just get some freeze frames here, first one to look at is the very brief initial shot of the bomb going off, which is rather unusual. It's only a few frames, but this still here shows it very much sort of almost like a rising sun over the horizon image, with what appears to be pylons in front of it, immediately in front of it, which have not been affected yet by the explosion, which is a bit strange. The second shot is after the initial flash, which I believe is actually an edit or a cut to then what is then a smaller scale model. This is the classic box void, where there's no detail in the sky or the background, and we have these little boxy structures of some kind. I don't know what they're supposed to be. They don't look like buildings. They look like very small cubes or something. And then they're destroyed by the blast wave that very vividly comes towards the camera, and is very, very clearly lit by the bright, blinding light. And then they do another very careful edit to a third shot, which is now the regular explosion on location. The sky now has detail with cloud, and to the right of the image you can see the thin black vertical line of some sort of pylon or telegraph pole or signal pole, which has not been affected by this explosion. And then of course when you convert this back to the main image of the Joe-1 test after the explosion's gone off, there's no indication that there ever was any pylons, or there's no debris from these little boxy objects that it's supposed to have destroyed. So what we're seeing here is a kind of a. Firstly, they've got a very bright light, possibly the sun, taken at dawn, coming over the horizon and bleaching out the camera. And then they do an edit to a small-scale model where they do a detonation that destroys some little matchbox houses, very much like the Americans do in the Pathé Films 1950s atomic test video that was the first one I did in this series. Compare it to that, these sort of small-scale matchbox house things that they destroy, and they have the same kind of blast wave effect in that, and then you have the final shot, which is of the regular normal detonation they just did in the desert. So again, this is just artistry and careful editing to make it look like something interesting and unique, but it isn't. And then it gets worse, because then inevitably a tourist, an American fellow, has decided to go on holiday and visit this site because he wanted to see where it had taken place. So then wonderfully we have this footage taken from Ground Zero, where the Soviets supposedly detonated a 22 kiloton bomb.
This is Ground Zero for the first Soviet nuclear test in 1946. This pond is where the crater was, and if we look over towards the horizon in all directions, we see buildings radiating outward. And there's Mike in his respirator. And these buildings were used to assess the effects of the blast, some at very close range. But what I'd like to show you is the radiation levels out here. And to do that, I have a Geiger counter, currently with a pancake probe attached. And I will turn the speaker on. And you can see the radiation levels. Let's put this on the, that would be the 100,000 counts per minute level. And again, we're looking at a 2-inch pancake. Here on the ground are some very interesting chunks of stuff. That would be almost 100,000 counts per minute. This stuff on the ground is called karatonchiki. It's equivalent of trinitite in the United States. It's glass, a sort of nuclear glass that was formed in the various explosions that happened out here at Ground Zero. Let's put on a different probe so that we can assess the dosimetric exposure rate here at Ground Zero.
Alright, so Mike and his buddy, both wearing masks and little protective shoe slips, are out there in the Kazakh wilderness worrying about radiation. But yeah, look at the area they're in. This is crazy. Do I need to state the obvious? This pond is supposed to be a crater for a 22 kiloton bomb. The Baker test is supposed to be 23 kilotons. Hiroshima's 15. So something bigger than the supposed bomb that leveled Hiroshima went off there, and you've got this tiny little pond, and there's no blast zone, there's nothing scorched, glassed, there's no glassed earth, there's plants everywhere, it's a completely normal field, and yeah, it's ridiculous. I like the shit Kazakh knockoff version of Trinitite that doesn't look anything like the American version. That's fun. I appreciate that he's found one piece of glass or whatever that is, that this thing that he's telling us is Kazakh Trinitite, and it shouldn't just be one lump on the ground. There should be a whole area that's glassed, because we're talking huge fireballs, enormous amounts of heat, etc. You're not going to find just like one little lump of glass in the middle of, around it you can see plants, you can see small stones, you can see areas that are obviously unaffected by scorching and damage. So the fact that there's this chunk of whatever it is that he's telling us is, this must be the glass. Yeah, that's not going to prove anything to me. It's pretty straightforward. This is just an empty field in the middle of nowhere. Just didn't expect anyone to bother to go all the way out to rural Kazakhstan, which is fair enough for the late 40s, but nowadays we know better. So they say that an American spy plane flying between Japan and Alaska managed to detect the Soviet detonation, and that's how they knew the Soviets had nukes. And then we can see some other photos here, subsequently, of other later Soviet atomic detonations. And you don't even get video now, you just get one image per bomb. They're all terrible, no scale from a distance in the middle of nowhere. By the mid-50s, the Soviets then also supposed to have a hydrogen bomb, the bomb 2.0 essentially. Obvious fake image is obvious. The spout of smoke coming up the middle of it, just ends abruptly, and the whole thing is transparently pasted together. So I hope I don't need to go into more detail to break that down. That should be fairly straightforward to see with your own eyes now. The Soviets did a lot of their atomic work in the town of Sarov, or as it was known at the time, Arzamas 16. It was a secret city. They took it off the maps, so people couldn't know about it unless they were in the Russian military. Essentially, it was the whole place was sealed off to outsiders, and they worked on it. There's a photo here of the theoretical laboratory they had for looking into and researching nuclear weaponry. And they also had they have a museum which shows the various nuclear weapons that the Soviets are supposed to have built. It's interesting because you can sort of see, it's nice to look at these old photos and see just how low budget these places were. They're not highly sophisticated areas. The museum is really quite quaint and old-fashioned, with little portraits hanging on the walls, and these bomb shells, casings that they can prop up and have big bombs and things. And it's all very impressive. And I like the idea as well that even though you're dealing with nuclear fission, where ultimately you're looking at a few kilograms of fissile material, we're still going with the psychology of conventional bomb manufacture, where you want a bigger shell casing to deliver more explosive, which is normally what you need with regular conventional chemical explosives. But they're still doing that, even though it should be with fission. It should be just refining the process of having that uncontrolled reaction and having neutrons collide and releasing energy more efficiently, as opposed to just having a bigger lump of uranium or plutonium in the middle. So they've got these old bomb casings lined up. One of them is, in fact, the Tsar Bomba, which is the largest weapon ever developed. This would have been a 50 megaton bomb, so not a kiloton bomb, but a megaton bomb, which they detonated in the middle of nowhere in the north of Russia. It's a hydrogen bomb, and the photos we've got of it are great. We've got this, which has a little bit more detail, and finally the spectacular fireball image here, which is definitely not them just filming the bloody sun again so that it bleaches out the camera. So it's just the usual nonsense of we're gonna whack a mushroom cloud coming over the skyline, and that's it. That's all the evidence. That's all we've got. So again, it's just sort of silly pictures and a weapon that they themselves admit was purely created for political propagandistic use, and as a nuclear deterrent, it's not actually useful as a weapon. It essentially is too big. It's too bulky. The not worth it for what it is. So again, the Russian arsenal of nuclear weaponry, I'm aware that obviously it's developed and that over time it's supposed to have changed and they've got new things, and I don't really want to go through every single thing they've ever supposedly built, but you can see that key point here is that they didn't invent the things themselves. They had to steal the ideas from the Americans, who didn't have it anyway. They've then got a ridiculous fake lightning bomb, which clearly didn't happen because we can look at the scene of the crime and there was nothing there, and we can look at the video, which was, as I said, a bit of clever editing. And you can also then just look at, as one example, Tsar Bomba, and you can see the stupid photos they've got for that as well. So again, the Russians don't have anything. So USA, they've got nothing. Soviet Union, they've got nothing.
Not this one. Not this one. You fuck, you got nothing. There's not a lot of talking of bad. You hear? Because you got nothing. You got nothing in court. You don't got the bookkeeper. You got nothing. Nothing. And if you were a man, you would have done it now. You don't got a thing, you punk.
And now we can move on. We can look at the next one. So the next one to see on the list is the UK. So the story of the British bomb is quite interesting. Originally, the British were one of the first essentially the first country to start seriously working on nuclear bomb research through the secret project Tube Alloys. A lot of people know about the Manhattan Project, not so many people I think know about Tube Alloys. We were in there at day one, trying to research how to have a fission bomb work. We then collaborated with the Americans, who got on board with it as well when their Manhattan Project started, and we tried to share data, and we shared personnel and things like that. So what you would expect to happen is that by the end of the war, there would be a sharing of data, and the British would have a nuclear weapon as well. And that didn't happen. Now, partly they say this is because of various reasons, mostly to do with politics and statecraft, and they try to say, well, no, the Americans wanted to hold on to this as a special weapon for them. Wikipedia tells us that a big issue was the amount of spies who were coming via British personnel lines, like Klaus Fuchs, who, the British had gotten over there, and he was a major leak. They also try and pin it on this character, Alan Nunn May, who was allegedly a British physicist and convicted Soviet spy. What I'm finding a little bit weird about this is that the reason I say allegedly is because if we look at his photo, that's not a real photo. That's basically a drawing. If you look at his neck, if you look at the shirt, his actual shoulders and his shirt and tie, that's a two-dimensional drawing. That's not real. The details of the man's face as well, I don't know what's going on with his forehead there, why the man has no pores. It's a very weird, his ears don't have detailing. It's very strange. There's also like a very visible white line around the outside. If you look on the left side of his right side, our left side, as we look at the image, at his ear and his jawline, there's this kind of white line going around it. So again, Alan Nunn May, apparently a spy, apparently a British physicist. Unclear why Wikipedia's official photo of him is a drawing and a paste-up job. A bit strange. But yeah, I don't really have time to look into that right now. Moving on though. So the upshot was that the Americans basically turned around at the end of World War II and essentially told us to go do one. We had a contract with them where they would share data. The Americans then, being quite trollish of them, they basically pretended that they didn't know anything about it. We don't know anything about this agreement. We then ended up sending them a photocopy of the contract that they'd signed previously, that they'd agreed to, saying that we'll share data, we'll collaborate on nukes. And they said, we don't know this is genuine because we've lost our copy of it. So it was just a lot of nonsense basically. So what happened from this is that Britain was basically left out in the cold. We didn't know how to make a nuclear reactor. We didn't know how to make nuclear weapons. It was just a complete farce, basically, even though we've been collaborating with them on it from the beginning, as I say. So this eventually leads to the arrival of Absolute Chad, Chief of the Air Staff Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Lord Tedder, who essentially demanded that we have nukes, because this is an outrage. Britain needs nukes. This is of highest urgency and importance. So old Tedder, he says, let's crack on, let's do this. And so we began our own weapons design. There's a lot to go over with this, and I don't really want to get into the micro detailing here, but essentially we then tried to use the information we already knew, and it does seem like we basically did a bit of spying, a bit of having dinners with American scientists to nice little meetups to try and find out what they knew, and we ended up with some information. So this led to the British nuclear test called Operation Hurricane. Now this took place in 1952, so it took quite a while for us to get it together, several years for it to come about. But what ended up happening is Northwest Australia, we have a bomb allegedly, we sail it out to these islands off the northwest coast of Australia, the Montebello Islands. On 3rd of October 1952, we detonated a 25 kiloton plutonium implosion bomb. So this is we decided to skip over the gun type because screw the gun type, right? Everyone wants the cheeky plutonium implosion device. That's the best one.
So in 1946, the new Labour government faced a critical decision. The Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, chaired a top-secret meeting to decide whether Britain should go it alone and build a bomb. The need for post-war reconstruction had to be weighed against the controversial idea that to be a superpower, Britain needed a nuclear bomb. Michael Perrin was at the meeting.
The Prime Minister summed up very much on the lines of what the country couldn't stand, the money to do it, we haven't got the materials, present crisis in the country and all the rest of it. And at that stage, the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Bevin, came in and said, no, Prime Minister, that won't do at all. We've got to have this. And quite bluntly, he said, I don't want any other Foreign Secretary of this country to be talked at by a Secretary of State in the United States, as I have just had in my discussions with Mr. Burns. We've got to have this thing over here, whatever it costs, and we've got to have a bloody Union Jack flying on top of it. And that swung the meeting right round.
So that's a really nice little clip from the documentary Britain's Nuclear Bomb, The Inside Story. And I play that section because the way I read that is that the British government there, we're properly fucked off with the Americans. They've reneged on us, they're hiding this data, and now we're left out of the superpower club, essentially. The Americans now can beat us in a war with nuclear weaponry, and we'd have been doubly fucked off once the Soviets had it as well.
The Soviet Union had exploded an atom bomb, named Joe 1 after its leader, Joseph Stalin.
The British government, like the American government, was simply astonished when the Russians successfully tested a nuclear weapon. There was shock and there was terror. The threat was at the door, and Britain had to have a bomb of its own as soon as possible.
So exactly like they're saying there, we have to have this weapon, whatever it takes. And what I would strongly focus on here is that because the Americans are bluffing, the Americans can't share any data with us for a very good reason. It's not just because they want to be top dog with the bomb. It's because they don't have anything. It's a fake weapon. So they've got nothing to share. But the idea of them having it is enough for them to go, haha, we're the best. And when the Russians lie and say, well, of course we've got one too. Because, you know, anything you can do, we can do just as well. In fact, our bombs are even bigger. Our bombs are stupidly huge. So there's already this kind of bluff off going on, playing chicken with each other, and the British government are there in the middle, essentially going, look, this is outrageous. If the bloody Americans can have it, we need to have it as well. So this is where it kind of goes from the initial lie for American hegemony to be secured to the Russians getting it, because they need to have a deterrent, because otherwise, you know, they're going to face internal problems and criticism, saying, well, how are we supposed to beat the Americans with this huge weapon? That balance of the Russians and the Americans having the fake bomb each, creates a stalemate, and then that sets us up for the second half of the 20th century with the Cold War, which is what this bloody lie led to. And then the British are the start of kind of the next phase, which is the kind of the Me Too of it for Britain and for France, where we are previously global powers. We've been absolutely ravaged by the first half of the 20th century with World War I and World War II, and the economic and mass casualties of those two wars. And so we're absolutely battered, but we want to have the impression of status as a global superpower. And the only way to have that now in this new world, post-World War II, is to have nuclear weaponry. If you don't have nuclear weaponry, you can't be sat at the big boys table. And that's what they're talking about there in this meeting. And that's why they're saying we've got to have a nuke no matter what. And absolutely, they'd be prepared to lie and fake it if they couldn't make it.
This footage of Reg with the bomb has never been seen before. He had to address a serious problem with the release mechanism.
One flight to Orford Ness, a bomb came loose over Dorking. It fell off its hook. Luckily, the bomb doors were strong enough to hold it, and the pilot took the aircraft over the Thames estuary, opened the bomb doors, the bomb fell out, and the splash nearly drowned a couple of sailors who happened to be nearby. They never found it. It's still under the Thames somewhere.
Fortunately, the bomb was a dummy, with no explosive or radioactive material. But there was another issue that was harder to solve. The atom bomb weighed less than a conventional device, which meant that when it was released from the bomb bay, it could be lifted by an updraft of air flowing under the aircraft fuselage.
If you didn't watch it, the bomb could climb back up into the bomb bay because of the forces on it, and that, of course, was the last thing you wanted to happen.
You know, they had various fuses on them, and if they hit something, it would have gone bang. I mean, it was a really critical. We used to have the phrase that you're doing a job and you get a stopper, and this was a stopper that could have stopped it dead in its tracks.
So there we've got some anecdotes and clips about dummy bombs that they were flying around for whatever reason, and you know, the unexpected logistical hassle of nuclear bombs being so light that they whiz back up into the bomb bay after you've opened the doors. Funny that the Enola Gay never had that problem, or Boxcar never had that problem. But there we go. So these guys are absolutely adorable, and they, you know, they work their socks off. And what ended up happening is that you had the plucky British overcome all these problems, and of course we did the logical thing, which was to hire a wedding photographer to take the images of our super weapon.
In February 1952, Operation Hurricane was launched. The aircraft carrier HMS Campania escorted an old destroyer, HMS Plym, on her last voyage. On board the Plym was the atomic bomb, which was to be exploded in her hold just off the Australian coast. Ted Baker, then a 19-year-old new recruit, was one of the photographers on the mission.
It was exciting because it was so different to what I'd done beforehand, you know, attending weddings, christenings, portrait photography and so forth on there. So it's totally different, totally different.
The explosion was scheduled for October the 3rd, 1952. The Plym was abandoned with the atomic bomb on board.
I wonder why they didn't just drop the bomb out of a plane, because it'd be a lot quicker to fly the bomb to Australia than it would be to sail it in a ship all the way from England. And I wonder why, if not flying it, why they didn't just detonate the bomb on one of the islands. If you're going to detonate it in the water inside a ship, why didn't they just blow it up in the middle of the ocean if they're worried about it affecting places?
Ted Baker was watching from HMS Campania, 15 miles away.
So 15 miles, that's about 24 kilometres, using Nuke Map, for a 25 kiloton warhead. It's a bit unclear of exactly where they parked it up. They've got the coordinates for it as actually on the large island in the top right of this map that's diagonally going northwest to southeast. Normally the coordinates they give you for the detonation would actually be in the narrow bit of the island on land, but they appear to have the ship parked in the water. So I'm assuming they've put it somewhere in the middle of the island chain, for argument's sake, next to where the island is. The blast radius clearly overlaps large sections of the island, including the thermal radiation zone, which will give you third-degree burns going out to 14 kilometres, and you would still, at 37 kilometres, have blast damage. So at the distance they're talking about there of being 24 kilometres away, you'd still be in danger of burns flash damage and a bit of the shockwave hitting you, presumably damaging instrumentation on board the ships. So that's a bit of an odd one, that. Alright, so next up I'm going to play the detonation itself, and let's see how many of the things that are wrong with this you can spot.
I was on deck at the time. There was an air of quietness, and there's this feeling, wondering what's going to happen. You know, one or two of the sailors, you could see them sort of with a strained look on their face, listening to the countdown.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now.
And then when the bomb went off, the flash of light appears. I mean, we had our backs to it, and then when you could sort of turn round, it didn't look like I thought it would look. It developed into this zigzag, you know, as the wind took it.
In scientific terms, the explosion was a massive success, with a yield of 25 kilotons, more powerful than the bomb dropped over Nagasaki.
Okay, so that's a fiery explosion. It's a chemical explosion because it's got that dark, smoky cloud. What you're looking at there is they've got this ship and they've just detonated conventional high explosive in the bowels of the ship, and that has created this explosion, which doesn't have a mushroom cloud. It has a black chemical smoke cloud, which has been captured on film with a very minor flash, very minor shockwave. The camera's a lot closer to it than most of these other explosions compared to something like Baker, for example, which is 23 kiloton for scale. This is a much smaller explosion, clearly, and the wind immediately starts to drift it away. You're not getting a tidal surge in the same way. It's basically, we're just looking at a ship blowing up. So this explains why they sailed the bomb all the way from England to Australia. Why they didn't just fly the nuke across, drop it on the desert island and have it go boom? Because this way, you can, if you have one bomb that's dropped out of a plane, you need to somehow make it do lots of special things, make it very, very high explosive, have the bright flash as well. With this, it's all inside the ship, so they can just stack it full of TNT or whatever. The sailors are then standing on the deck without protective gear, with their backs to the explosion. You can see again in the background here how small the explosion is, and how it is just a conventional large explosion through normal explosives. The fact that they've turned their backs does not mean that they wouldn't be affected by the gamma radiation, for example. So what the heck is going on there? Turning your back to it, it would still go through your skull and affect your eyes. It's not going to... This is very much like with the nonsense of Trinity, where they had the US soldiers standing very close to the blast, and the idea that, you know, if you closed your eyes or something, it would be fine. And of course, who do they have observing this? Well, they have a small, controlled crowd of 19-year-old, you know, basically teenage squaddies, essentially, who are just standing there in their shorts, and they're told, right, turn around, lads, look at that, oh, isn't that scary? Now you can attest that we've got this bomb. Why don't they just have a small team of scientists, you know, with clipboards and monitoring equipment? Why do they need a bunch of cadets to stand on top of the ship, where they're at the most risk of being injured? And I like as well that the guy says it didn't look like I expected it to look, because even at that age he'd already, you know, seen the images of what a nuclear bomb was supposed to look like, and then this thing goes off and it's just, he's like, oh, that's a bit strange. So yeah, again, this is just theatre. This is just propaganda and theatre. They're staging it and they're giving it a small controlled audience to give this impression, so now they can turn around to the Americans and go, hey, we've got the bomb too.
The first few seconds of the explosion were filmed on a specially built camera, which could capture more frames per second than any other camera in existence at the time.
And it wouldn't be a fake nuke bit of theatre unless they had special cameras, because we love our special cameras in this business. So the British have a special camera. Let's see the footage.
This is the Kersol Cine camera. It ran at 150,000 frames a second. It was designed specifically for the very early stages of when the bomb went off.
Now, for the first time, Aldermaston has released the images taken by the camera.
is a bit sort of thin there, but it is the very, very early stages of the weapon going off.
These are taken every 8 millionths of a second, and they show the fireball developing. And there's a great interest in the rate of growth of the fireball because it gives a good idea of what the overall yield is.
And yep, that's much worse than the actual main propaganda video in the BBC4 documentary.
William Penny and his scientists measured the size of the historic test, but not all his instruments were high-tech.
William Penny would use all sorts of sophisticated methods to do it, but also anything that came to hand, like bent jerry cans. And in this case, Penny was able to deduce exactly what pressure struck these paint tubes, and since he knew the distance, he could tell what the device had produced in the way of a yield. And it was a very simple and cheap and maybe rather British way of doing things.
I'm not even going to dignify that with analysis.
Since this test and the others that followed, thousands of veterans have claimed they've suffered health problems as a result. Claims which have not been accepted by successive governments.
Because they know that they weren't injured by gamma ray radiation, because there was no nuke. They were probably affected by something else, and it could well be the government's fault, but it wouldn't have been that.
But the political significance of the test was clearer. For Winston Churchill, who'd just been re-elected as Prime Minister, it marked Britain's entry into the nuclear club.
Once we had fired an atom bomb, the feeling was that we were now in the same nuclear league as America and Russia, and that therefore it would be reasonable to seek a reopening of the exchanges that we'd had with the Americans during the war.
What a grin. Look at that face. Look at it. Look at that lizard grin. He knows what's going on here. And this is exactly what I've been talking about. Now we've got a nuke, or at least now that we're saying we've got a nuke, you've got to treat us with respect. And you can look at his face. So I wonder what the Americans thought when we sent them a letter or some photos and went, Yabu sucks, we've got a nuke too. I wonder what they said in their little CIA brainstorming sessions, trying to work out what they were going to do, how they're going to handle this development that the bloody limeys had stepped up to the plate and were calling their bluff. There must have been some late night meetings with coffee and takeout as they handled this, and they thought, what are we going to do? How are we going to spin this? Because they can't say, well, you don't have it because it doesn't exist, because then that undermines their own position. And everyone looks stupid then. So we've totally called their bluff. So the only thing that the Americans could do is up the ante, and that's exactly what they did.
But the feeling of triumph was short-lived. Just 3 weeks later, the Americans exploded Ivy Mike. This was an entirely new type of nuclear bomb, 400 times more powerful than the atomic bomb the British had just tested. It was the first hydrogen bomb.
So the hopes that the British had that by showing they could make an atomic bomb, they would put themselves level with the Americans, were lost. Suddenly they were miles behind again. As one congressman put it when it was suggested that they should resume contacts with the British, he said, "Why would we trade a horse for a rabbit?"
Well played, lads. So tell me more. How does this new Nuke 2.0 work?
And that horse was a bomb which had breached a new frontier in nuclear physics. It was so powerful because instead of using fission, the splitting of atoms, it had succeeded in harnessing the power of nuclear fusion. This required massive pressure and temperature to fuse atoms together and create exponential amounts of energy.
Ah, for God's sake. So up till now, everything's been about fission and things flying apart, releasing energy, severing atomic links and so on. And now they're saying, well, actually, it's even more powerful if you do the opposite and you fuse the atoms together through pressure, and yeah, oh God, I can't even. The photos they've got of it, half of it is just the sun rising or setting behind clouds, and the stupid liquid bubbles on development paper. How convenient that they managed to detonate this terrifying new weapon a mere 3 weeks after we upped our game. That's incredible timing. Next, you're going to be telling me that the Russians magically discover hydrogen bombing in parallel at a politically opportune time.
A year later, the Soviet Union exploded Joe 4, their own hydrogen bomb. The Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, responded by making the controversial decision that Britain should build its own hydrogen bomb. For national prestige, to impress the Americans, and to deter Soviet aggression.
I have no words. This is just getting silly now. Let's move on. In the next part, we're going to look at the remaining countries, which would be China, France, Pakistan and India, and the North Korean Republic. So we're going to cover that in part 2. One thing I would say ahead of time is that the quality of the fakery is going to go off a cliff as we move away from the comparatively sophisticated propaganda units of the US, Great Britain and Russia, and we descend into the third world. Well, sorry, France. I guess you're not technically third world, but you know what I mean. The lower budget version of things. So I think there's going to be some lulls in this, but I think this video, it was worth going through in a bit of detail and just trying to unpick how did this information go from Trinity to the Soviet Union to England. How did these projects develop? And the ridiculous nature when you actually just look at it critically, how it just falls apart like soggy tissue paper. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next part shortly.